The time has come to read the last will and testament. This footage, it's just a misunderstanding.
I will not stand for this. You are strong, Father. Just rest now.
I'm sorry, I need more time. I'll make it up to you, I promise. Too late. It's over.
I have something important to say. After all this time, this is what you've chosen. I never meant for things to turn out like this. I'm sorry.
You have no right to cause a scene now.
You lied. I'm taking everything.
I learned that a family can bury a man in the afternoon and bury a woman's dignity before dinner. The rain had started before we returned from the cemetery, soft at first, then heavy enough to blur the tall windows of the Whitmore estate. It ran down the glass in silver lines, turning the lights of the driveway into pale, trembling stars. I stood in the main hall with my black coat still damp at the shoulders, holding the folded handkerchief William Whitmore had kept beside his hospital bed for the last 6 months of his life. It smelled faintly of cedar, medicine, and the peppermint tea I used to make him when the pain kept him awake. The marble floor beneath my heels felt colder than the November air outside. No one spoke his name. Not his wife. Not his son. Not the relatives who had filled the pews at the funeral and whispered about inheritance before the flowers were even placed on his grave. They only looked at me. Margaret Whitmore stood near the staircase in her tailored black dress, pearls shining at her throat like drops of ice. She had not cried once that day. Daniel stood beside her, my husband of 3 years, his tie loosened, his face tired but unreadable. A few feet behind him was Vanessa Reed, wearing a black dress too elegant for grief and a polite expression that did not reach her eyes. I remember the sound before I understood it. The wheels of my suitcase scraped across the floor. One of the house staff pushed it forward, ashamed to meet my eyes. My old brown suitcase, the one I had brought when I first married Daniel, rolled to a stop beside my feet. Margaret placed one hand on the banister and looked at me as if I were a stain the rain had dragged inside. "This family doesn't need you anymore, Emily," she said. Her voice was calm. That made it worse. I looked at Daniel. Just once. I waited for him to say my name, to tell his mother she was grieving badly, to remind everyone that I had been William's daughter-in-law, his caregiver, the person who slept in a chair beside him when the private nurses went home. Daniel only looked toward the window, where the rain struck harder against the glass. His silence entered me more deeply than any insult could have. Margaret nodded toward the front door. "You came here with nothing. You may leave the same way." My fingers tightened around William's handkerchief. I did not beg. I did not explain. I had already learned that explanations were wasted on people who enjoyed misunderstanding you. I picked up the handle of my suitcase. It was heavier than I remembered, or maybe my hand was simply tired from holding myself together. Vanessa lowered her eyes, but I saw the small curve of her mouth. Daniel saw it too. He still said nothing. When the front door opened, the cold air rushed in and lifted the edge of my coat. Rain blew across the threshold and dotted the marble at my feet. For one moment, I turned back and looked at the house where I had cooked, cleaned, waited, forgiven, and prayed for a family that never truly wanted me. Above the porch, the security camera moved with a soft mechanical click, slowly turning until its dark eye followed me. I stepped into the rain with my suitcase in one hand and William's handkerchief in the other, and behind me, the door closed with the final sound of a verdict. I had taken only 3 steps down the wide stone stairs when my phone vibrated inside my coat pocket. The screen glowed through the rain. It was Samuel Brooks, the Whitmore family attorney. His message was only one sentence. "Mrs. Whitmore, do not leave town before the will is read." Samuel's message stayed on my screen until the rain made the letters blur beneath my thumb. I stood at the edge of the driveway, where the Whitmore gates were still half a football field away, and I remembered the first night I had walked through them as Daniel's wife. Back then, the house had looked like something from an old East Coast magazine, all white columns, trimmed hedges, and warm windows glowing against the dark. I had worn a simple cream dress from a small boutique in Albany, and Margaret had looked at the price tag before she looked at my face. William was the only one who had stood to greet me. He had taken both my hands and said, "Welcome home, Emily." For a long time, I tried to believe that one kind voice could make a home out of a cold place. I learned every hallway, every locked cabinet, every room where people lowered their voices when I entered. I learned that Margaret liked her coffee at 140 degrees, that Daniel hated confrontation more than cruelty, and that the staff knew more about a family than any family ever suspected. I also learned William's breathing patterns. I knew when he was pretending the pain was small. I knew which blanket kept his knees warm without making him uncomfortable. I knew he hated hospitals, hated being treated like an old name attached to a fortune, and hated the way his relatives visited only when the doctor used words like estate planning. During those last 6 months, I slept more often in the leather chair beside his bed than in the room I shared with Daniel. I read him the financial pages, then old baseball stories, then letters from people who had received scholarships through his foundation. Sometimes, at 2 in the morning, when the mansion was silent and the security lights brushed across the lawn, William would look at me with tired blue eyes and ask if Daniel was being good to me. I always said yes. It was the kind of lie a woman tells when she is still trying to protect the man who is slowly letting her disappear. William never argued. He only watched me with a sadness that felt almost like an apology. The rest of the family called my care devotion when guests were around and desperation when they thought I could not hear. Margaret once told her sister that women like me survived by making themselves useful. I stood in the pantry with a tray of tea in my hands and said nothing. But that night, William asked me to open the top drawer of his bedside table. Inside was a small silver key on a plain ring, no label, no explanation. His fingers shook when he pressed it into my palm. "Keep this somewhere safe," he whispered. I asked what it opened. He looked toward the closed bedroom door, then back at me. "When they throw you away," he said, "this will bring you back." Daniel had not always been cruel. That was the part that made his silence harder to survive. When I first met him at a charity auction in Saratoga Springs, he had stood apart from the Whitmore crowd with his sleeves rolled to his elbows and a tired smile that made him look less like an heir and more like a man trying to breathe under a name too heavy for him. He spilled coffee on his own cuff, laughed softly, and apologized to the waiter before anyone else noticed. I loved that about him. I loved the quiet places in him. I loved the way he drove with one hand on the wheel and the other resting near mine, not holding too tightly, just close enough to make me feel chosen. For a while, I believed he chose me because I made his life simple. Later, I understood that he chose me because I asked for so little. I did not ask for diamond bracelets. I did not ask for vacations to Aspen or a house in the Hamptons. I asked him to come home for dinner. I asked him to visit his father. I asked him to look at me when his mother spoke about me like I was temporary. Those were the things he could not give. The change happened slowly, like winter moving across a lake. At first, he only stayed later at the office. Then he stopped calling when meetings ran long. Then he began repeating Margaret's words in a gentler voice, as if softness could make them less sharp. "Mother thinks you should let the nurses handle Dad. Mother thinks you are too emotional. Mother thinks people are starting to talk." I used to answer carefully. I used to believe a marriage could be repaired if one person remained patient enough. Then Vanessa Reed joined Whitmore Holdings as a public relations consultant. She was polished, confident, and always standing in the right photograph. She knew which reporters mattered, which donors Margaret wanted to impress, and how to laugh at Daniel's smallest jokes as though he had saved the room from silence. I never hated her. Hatred requires energy, and by then most of mine belonged to medicine schedules, legal envelopes on William's desk, and the lonely side of a bed Daniel no longer seemed to notice. What hurt was not Vanessa's perfume lingering near his coat or her name appearing too often on his phone. What hurt was watching Daniel become proud of being admired by someone who had never seen him tired, guilty, or afraid. At the funeral, she stood, 2 rows behind the family, close enough to be noticed but far enough to pretend respect. When the service ended, I reached for Daniel's hand out of habit. His fingers moved away before mine touched them. A few minutes later, in the quiet hallway outside the chapel, I saw his hand wrapped around Vanessa's, and neither of them let go when they saw me. By the time we returned to the estate, the dining room had already been prepared as if grief were another social event to manage. The long mahogany table shone beneath the chandelier, polished so brightly I could see the blurred shape of my face in it. White candles burned between arrangements of lilies, their sweetness mixing with the smell of rain and expensive wine. William's chair at the head of the table was empty, but Margaret had not left it untouched out of respect. She had placed a black folder in front of it, as if the man had barely been lowered into the ground before his place became a desk for business. I stood near the doorway for a moment, still wearing my funeral dress, still feeling the cold from the cemetery in my bones. No one asked if I wanted to sit. No one asked if I had eaten. Daniel took the chair to the right of his father's empty seat. Margaret took the left. Vanessa sat beside Daniel, in the chair where I had sat for 3 years, her hands folded neatly on the napkin in her lap. The relatives pretended not to notice. That was the talent-rich families practiced best. They could watch a wound open in the middle of a room and still discuss salad forks. Margaret lifted her glass, but did not drink. "Before tomorrow's formalities," she said, "this family needs clarity." Her eyes moved to me. William was generous to many people. Too generous at times. But we must be realistic about who belongs here now. I walked to the only empty chair near the far end of the table. It was close to the kitchen door, where servers came and went with lowered eyes. Daniel watched me sit there and said nothing. Margaret continued, her voice smooth enough to sound polite to anyone who did not understand cruelty. "Emily, your marriage to Daniel has become an unfortunate strain on this family. You have been allowed comfort, protection, and access far beyond what your background prepared you for. But William is gone now. There is no reason to continue pretending." A fork touched a plate somewhere down the table. The small sound made the silence feel larger. I looked at Daniel again. His hand rested beside his wine glass. Vanessa's fingers were close to his, not touching, but close enough to tell me what they wanted the room to understand. Daniel reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a cream envelope. He slid it across the table. It stopped halfway between us. "It is a separation agreement," he said. His voice was low, practiced, almost tired. "The attorneys can finalize everything quietly. You will receive a reasonable amount. Enough to start over." Reasonable. That word landed harder than it should have. As if 3 years of marriage, 6 months beside his dying father, and every insult I had swallowed could be measured like a line item in a budget. Margaret leaned back, satisfied. "You should sign tonight. Leave with dignity while you still can." Vanessa lowered her gaze, but not before I saw relief soften her face. She believed this was the moment I became small. Maybe all of them did. I placed my hand on the envelope. The paper felt cold beneath my palm. For a second, I thought about William's silver key hidden inside the lining of my purse. I thought about his tired eyes and the warning he had given me in the dark. Then I looked at Daniel, at Margaret, at the empty chair where William should have been, and I heard my own voice come out calm. "You are doing this before the will is read?" The room reacted before anyone answered. A soft laugh came from somewhere near the middle of the table, then another, then the delicate clink of Margaret setting her glass down with too much control. Daniel looked at me as if I had embarrassed him by remembering that William still had a voice in the room, even if it was folded inside a legal document waiting for morning. Vanessa's eyes lifted to mine for half a second, bright with something close to pity. That was almost funny. Pity is easiest to give when you believe you are standing above someone. Margaret smiled without warmth. "The will has nothing to do with you." She said it slowly, as if teaching a child not to touch silverware. "William may have been sentimental near the end, but he was still a Whitmore. This estate belongs to blood, legacy, and responsibility." I looked at the envelope under my hand. My name was typed across the front in Daniel's attorney's careful font. Emily Carter Whitmore. It looked official. It also looked small. Daniel pushed his chair back a few inches, not enough to stand, just enough to show impatience. "Emily, do not make this harder than it has to be." His voice carried the gentle warning he used when he wanted obedience to sound like concern. "Sign it. Take the settlement. Get some rest. We can speak through lawyers after tomorrow." After tomorrow. The words moved through me like a cold draft. They all wanted me gone before the one thing William had left behind could speak. I felt the silver key inside the hidden pocket of my purse, pressed against the fabric like a small piece of truth. My hands did not shake this time. That surprised me. Maybe pain, when it becomes deep enough, stops trembling and simply becomes still. Margaret lifted her chin toward the doorway. "Your suitcase is being brought down. I will not have this family's grief turned into a performance." One of the younger cousins looked away. Claire Whitmore, Daniel's sister, sat near the far end of the table with her napkin twisted in her lap. She did not defend me, but her face had gone pale. I wondered if she remembered all the mornings I had driven William to his appointments when everyone else was too busy. I wondered if anyone at that table remembered anything that did not benefit them. Daniel picked up a pen and placed it beside the envelope. "Please," he said quietly, "do not force me to handle this publicly." That was when I understood. He was not afraid of hurting me. He was afraid of being seen hurting me. I removed my wedding ring slowly. The diamond caught the chandelier light once, then went dull in my palm. I placed it on top of the separation agreement, directly over his signature line. No one moved. Even Margaret stopped smiling. I stood, smoothing the front of my black dress with both hands. "I am not signing tonight," I said. My voice was not loud. It did not need to be. "And I hope tomorrow remembers tonight." Margaret's mouth tightened. Daniel whispered my name, but it no longer sounded like a place to return to. Behind me, the staff member appeared with my suitcase, eyes lowered, shoulders tense with shame that did not belong to him. I took the handle, walked past Vanessa's chosen chair, past Daniel's silent hands, past William's empty seat, and toward the front door. No one followed me. No one apologized. When the door opened, rain swept across the threshold like the house itself was exhaling. I stepped outside before they could see what it cost me, and as the door closed behind me, I heard the security camera above the porch turn again, soft and steady, as if the night had been told to keep watching. The hotel clerk looked at my wet hair, my black dress, and the suitcase dripping onto the lobby floor, and asked no questions. I was grateful for that. Some kindness arrives as silence. The place was small, tucked beside a county road about 15 miles from the Whitmore estate, with a soda machine humming near the elevator and framed photographs of Lake George on the walls. My room smelled like clean sheets, lemon cleaner, and rain trapped in wool. I set my suitcase by the dresser and stood for a long moment without turning on all the lights. Only the lamp beside the bed glowed, soft and yellow, making the room feel temporary but safe. My phone sat on the nightstand with Samuel Brooks's message still open. "Do not leave town before the will is read." I read it once, then again. Then I placed the phone face down, because one more sentence from that house might have broken something I was working very hard to keep whole. My coat was soaked through. When I slipped my hand into the inner lining, my fingers found the silver key William had given me. It was warmer than it should have been, as if it had held the last heat from his palm all these months. I sat on the edge of the bed and opened my purse. Beneath a pack of tissues, my driver's license, and the folded receipt from the pharmacy where I used to pick up William's medication, there was the small envelope he had asked me to keep hidden. I had never opened it. Not because I did not wonder. Because William had looked so tired when he gave it to me, and I had promised him I would wait until I had no other choice. That night, with rain ticking against the window and my wedding ring left on a table that no longer felt like mine, I knew the waiting was over. Inside the envelope was a note in William's handwriting. The letters were unsteady, but still elegant. "Emily, if you are reading this, then they have shown you the truth I hoped I was wrong about. Go to Whitmore Private Trust on Madison Avenue. Box 417. Use the key. Ask for Mr. Harlan only. Trust Samuel, but trust what I left you more." I pressed the paper to my chest and closed my eyes. For the first time that night, tears came, but they were quiet. Not the kind that begged to be heard. The kind that washed the last illusion from my face. At 7 the next morning, I put on the only dry dress I had packed, tied my damp hair at the nape of my neck, and took a cab into Albany. The bank opened at 8:30. Mr. Harlan was an older man with silver eyebrows and a navy suit that looked as if it had never known a wrinkle. When I gave him my name, he did not look surprised. He only said, "Mr. Whitmore said you would come when the house forgot its manners." In the private room, box 417 opened with one soft click. Inside lay a sealed letter, a flash drive, and a copy of a document stamped with the Whitmore family crest. At the top of the page, in bold type, were the words, "Conditional Inheritance Clause." While I sat in the private room at Whitmore Private Trust with William's final warning spread beneath my hands, the estate was already pretending I had never existed. I learned that later from Claire and from the housekeeper who had packed my suitcase with tears in her eyes, but I could almost feel it even then. The same dining room where they had pushed the separation agreement toward me had become a place of quiet celebration. Margaret ordered fresh flowers for the morning, Not lilies this time, but white roses, because she said lilies belonged to death and the Whitmore family needed to look forward. Daniel stayed in his father's study, making calls in that careful executive voice he used when he wanted people to think he was in control. Vanessa moved through the house softly, respectfully, but everyone noticed when she asked whether the blue guest suite upstairs would be available after the will reading. That suite shared a hallway with the main bedroom. Nothing in that house happened by accident. Margaret had the staff remove my place card from the small table outside the library where Samuel Brooks was scheduled to read the will at 10 o'clock. She told them it was an error. She said Mrs. Daniel Whitmore was no longer required. The name sounded strange to me when I heard it later, as if she had tried to erase me by removing the only part of it she never respected. At 9:15, Daniel stood in front of the fireplace in William's study, looking at the portrait of his father above the mantel. He must have believed the hard part was over. I could picture him smoothing his tie, convincing himself that what he had done was practical, not cruel. That was always Daniel's gift. He could wrap betrayal in calm language until it looked like responsibility. Margaret joined him with a folder of her own notes. She had already decided which charities would be reduced, which properties would be sold, and which board members would be reminded where their loyalties belonged. William had been buried less than 24 hours, and she was rearranging his life as though grief were a room in need of new furniture. Vanessa, meanwhile, stood by the window with a coffee she had not made herself, watching the rain lighten over the south lawn. She asked Daniel if I would cause trouble. He told her no. He said I was too emotional, too tired, too dependent on the settlement to fight. The words should have hurt when Claire repeated them to me months later, but by then they only confirmed what I had already known. He had never understood me. He mistook quiet for empty. He mistook patience for fear. At 9:40, Margaret instructed the front gate not to admit me unless Samuel personally requested it. She thought that would end the matter. She thought doors still obeyed her. In the bank's private room, I folded William's letter and placed the flash drive in my purse beside the silver key. Then my phone rang. Samuel Brooks did not greet me. He only said, "Emily, are you safe?" I looked down at the document stamped with the Whitmore crest and answered, "Yes." His breath eased, but his voice stayed firm. "Good. Come back to the estate now. They are trying to read the will without you, and Mr. Whitmore made that legally impossible." The cab ride back to the estate felt longer than 15 miles. Rain still clung to the morning, thin and gray now, turning the road into a strip of dull silver. I sat in the back seat with William's letter folded in my purse, the flash drive tucked beside it, and the silver key closed inside my palm. I did not know exactly what William had done. I only knew he had known enough to prepare for the moment his family tried to erase me. That thought hurt more than it comforted me. It meant he had seen everything. He had seen Margaret's cold smiles. He had seen Daniel's retreating eyes. He had seen me carrying trays, medicine bottles, clean blankets, and quiet excuses for people who never deserved them. By the time the cab turned onto the long private drive, my dress had dried, but my shoes were still stained from the night before. The iron gates opened after a pause just long enough to remind me that someone inside had questioned whether I belonged there. The house appeared through the trees, wide and white against the wet lawn, every window polished, every column steady, as if nothing cruel had happened on its front steps. I paid the driver, stepped out, and looked up at the porch camera. It was still there, small and black beneath the roofline. This time, I looked back at it. Inside, the estate was too quiet. The kind of quiet that comes before a family hears something it cannot control. A maid named Ruth saw me first. Her eyes filled, but she only whispered, "Mrs. Whitmore," and opened the library doors. Samuel Brooks stood at the head of the long table with his leather briefcase open in front of him. He wore a dark suit, steel-rimmed glasses, and the expression of a man who had spent his life watching rich people confuse money with law. Margaret was seated near the fireplace, stiff with offense. Daniel stood behind a chair, one hand on the back of it, his jaw tight. Vanessa was near the window, holding a cup of coffee she had not tasted. Claire sat in the corner, pale and silent. On the table lay the sealed will, untouched. Margaret turned when I entered, and the room changed. Not loudly, not dramatically, but every face moved toward me as if I had brought weather inside. "This is unnecessary," Margaret said. She was asked to leave last night. Samuel closed one folder with a precise movement. Mrs. Emily Whitmore was not asked to leave by the deceased. She is no longer part of this family, Daniel said. His voice was lower than it had been the night before. Samuel looked at him for a long second. Your father's legal documents disagree. Margaret stood. I will not have that woman sit here and listen to private family matters. For the first time since I had known him, Samuel's face hardened. Then the will not be read. The room went still. Even the rain seemed to soften against the windows. Margaret stared at him as if he had spoken in a language she refused to learn. Excuse me. Mr. Whitmore's instructions were explicit, Samuel said. The reading cannot begin unless Emily Carter Whitmore is present, identified, seated, and given the first copy of the document. Daniel's hand slipped from the chair. Vanessa looked down at her coffee. I stayed by the door because part of me still remembered being sent out through another one. Samuel turned toward me, and his voice became quieter. Mrs. Whitmore, please come forward. I walked across the library, past the portraits, past Daniel, past Margaret's sharp silence. Samuel pulled out the chair closest to the head of the table. William's chair. Margaret's breath caught. Why is she sitting there? She demanded. Samuel placed his hand on the sealed will and answered. Because Mr. Whitmore left her that seat. I sat in William's chair with my hands folded in my lap and felt the entire room resisting the sight of me there. The leather was cool beneath my fingers. The table smelled faintly of polish and old paper. For 3 years, I had stood behind that chair with a cup of tea or a folder William forgot in his study, never once imagining I would be asked to sit in it while his wife, his son, and the woman waiting to replace me watched in silence. Samuel placed a clean copy of the will in front of me first. Not Margaret, not Daniel, me. The paper was thick, cream-colored, and stamped with the Whitmore crest in dark blue ink. My name appeared on the first page, clear enough that no one could pretend it was a mistake. Margaret's face tightened. This is theatrical, she said. Samuel did not look up. This is procedure. Daniel leaned forward. Samuel, with respect, my father was heavily medicated in his final weeks. If Emily influenced him somehow, we need to know that before anything is read. The words entered the room softly, but I felt every edge. There it was. When they could not make me disappear, they would make me suspicious. I looked at Daniel, and for one brief second, I saw the man I had once loved hiding behind the man he had chosen to become. He looked nervous now, not grieving, not ashamed, nervous. Samuel removed his glasses and placed them on the table. Mr. Whitmore anticipated that accusation. Claire lifted her head. Margaret went still. Samuel opened another folder and withdrew a medical certification signed by William's attending physician, 2 witnesses, and a notary public. Your father requested a full capacity evaluation before amending his estate documents. He was declared mentally competent on October 3rd at 9:40 in the morning. Daniel's mouth closed. Vanessa shifted near the window, her coffee cup trembling just enough to send a small ripple across the surface. Samuel continued. He also requested that the reading be recorded and that all beneficiaries remain present until the final clause is disclosed. A strange pressure moved through the room. It was not fear exactly. It was the first awareness that William had not left behind money alone. He had left behind order. He had left behind memory. He had left behind traps only cruel people would fall into. Margaret reached for composure the way some women reach for pearls. Then read it, she said. Let us stop wasting time. Samuel looked at me, not for permission, but as if honoring an instruction only he understood. I gave the smallest nod. He opened the sealed document. The sound of the paper unfolding filled the library. Rain touched the windows. Somewhere in the hall, a grandfather clock counted the hour. Samuel began with William's full legal name, his residence, and the date. His voice was steady, formal, impossible to interrupt. Then he paused, turned the page, and read the first personal line William had left behind. To the first person who stayed when love became inconvenient, loyalty became costly, and my own blood became busy, I leave the truth first. Margaret's lips parted. Daniel looked at me as if I had written the sentence myself. I had not. I could barely breathe through it. Samuel turned the page again, and his next words made the room forget how to move. To Emily Carter Whitmore, my daughter by devotion if not by birth, I leave the first and controlling share of my estate. For one heartbeat, no one understood what controlling share meant. Or maybe they understood too well and refused to let the meaning enter their faces. Samuel let the silence hold until it became heavier than the rain outside. Then he read the next line. I leave to Emily Carter Whitmore 51% of voting shares in Whitmore Holdings, including full authority to appoint or remove executive board members after a 90-day transition period. Daniel stood so quickly his chair scraped against the floor. That is not possible. His voice broke on the last word, not loudly, but enough for everyone to hear the fear beneath it. Samuel did not look at him. It is fully possible. The transfer documents were executed, witnessed, and filed before Mr. Whitmore entered hospice care. Margaret gripped the edge of the table. Her pearls trembled against her throat. William would never give his company to her. Samuel turned one page. He did not give it to her. He said she had already earned the right to protect it. My hands stayed folded, but beneath the table my fingers pressed into my palm. I had not known about the shares. I had not known about the company. I only knew William had trusted me with a key, a letter, and the truth he could no longer carry alone. Samuel continued, his voice even. I leave to Emily Carter Whitmore the primary residence known as Whitmore House, including all surrounding acreage, guest cottages, staff quarters, archives, and private family records. The room seemed to shrink around us. The house they had pushed me out of less than 12 hours earlier now sat on the table between us with my name attached to every wall. Vanessa lowered herself into the chair by the window. Her coffee cup touched the saucer with a small, nervous sound. Daniel looked at me then, really looked, as if seeing my face for the first time without the comfort of believing I owned nothing. Samuel read on. I appoint Emily Carter Whitmore as chair of the William Whitmore Foundation, with full authority over its endowment, scholarship programs, charitable grants, and annual distributions. Claire covered her mouth with one hand. Her eyes filled, not with anger, but with something closer to recognition. She remembered the letters. She remembered the students who wrote to William every December. She remembered who had read those letters at his bedside when everyone else was too busy to listen. Margaret stood so abruptly her napkin fell to the floor. This is manipulation. She sat beside a dying man and filled his head with stories. For the first time, I spoke. I read him thank you letters from children your foundation helped. My voice was quiet, but it carried. You called them paperwork. Margaret's face went pale with offense, but Samuel raised one hand before she could answer. There is more. He removed a sealed envelope from the back of the folder. Across the front, in William's handwriting, were 3 words, before they object. Samuel opened it and read, If my family questions Emily's place in this room, show them what happened after my funeral. The library went completely still. Samuel looked at me. I reached into my purse and placed the flash drive from box 417 on the table. Daniel stared at it as if it were alive. A staff member brought in a laptop. No one spoke while Samuel connected the drive and turned the screen toward the room. The video opened with the front hall from the night before. There was Margaret, straight-backed beside the staircase. There was my suitcase rolling across the marble. There was Daniel, silent by the window. There was Vanessa, watching from behind him. And there I was, standing in my black dress with William's handkerchief in my hand, being told I no longer belonged. The video continued until the front door opened, until rain swept across the floor, until I stepped outside alone. When the door closed behind me on the screen, Samuel paused the recording. Daniel sat down slowly, as though his knees had forgotten their duty. Margaret did not move at all. Samuel turned back to the will and said, Mr. Whitmore added one final condition regarding anyone who removed Emily from this home before the reading. Samuel's words did not land like a threat. They landed like a signature already drying on paper. Margaret stared at the paused image on the laptop, where my back was turned toward the rain and the door had just closed behind me. For the first time since I had known her, she looked smaller than the room she ruled. Daniel kept his eyes on the table. Vanessa's hands were folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white. Samuel read the final condition in the same steady voice. Any beneficiary who, by word, action, instruction, or coordinated silence, attempts to remove Emily Carter Whitmore from Whitmore House before the reading of this shall forfeit all direct claims to the primary estate, executive voting authority, and discretionary family trust distributions, except those required by law. No one breathed for a second. Then Margaret said, Coordinated silence. Her voice cracked at the edge. Samuel looked at Daniel. Mr. Whitmore chose his language carefully. Daniel closed his eyes. I watched him understand it. Not just the money. Not just the house. He understood that his father had seen the exact shape of his weakness before he ever used it against me. Margaret turned on him. First, you should have stopped this. Daniel gave a bitter laugh without humor. You told me to let her leave. You are his son, and she was my wife. The word wife sounded strange from him now. Too late to be tender. Too late to be useful. Vanessa stood halfway, then sat again when no one looked at her. The room that had treated me like an inconvenience now had no place to put its fear. Samuel continued explaining the legal consequences, but his words blurred into the sound of rain and paper. Margaret would keep a limited personal allowance. Daniel would retain certain non-voting assets placed outside the estate years earlier, but his path to company control was gone. Vanessa had no standing at all. The room shifted around that truth. Her polished confidence faded first. Then Daniel's pride. Then Margaret's certainty. Claire began to cry quietly in the corner, not loudly enough to interrupt, but enough for me to know she finally understood that silence had a cost. Daniel rose from his chair and walked toward me. He stopped 3 feet away, as if the space between us had become legal property too. Emily, he said. I did not know he would do this. I looked at him. His tie was still perfectly knotted. His eyes were not. That is not an apology. His face tightened. I am sorry. The words came quickly, too quickly, like a man reaching for a falling glass. I was grieving. I was pressured. Mother was pushing, and everything with the company was unstable. I thought if we settled it quietly, it would be easier for everyone. For everyone, I repeated. He swallowed. For you too. That almost hurt enough to make me smile. Daniel, you let them put my suitcase in the rain 3 hours after your father was buried. He looked down. I was wrong. Margaret made a small sound behind him, but he did not turn. That was the first brave thing he had done all day, and it was still not enough. We can talk, he said. Privately. We can fix this. I thought of the woman I had been the night before, standing at that door with wet shoes and William's handkerchief in my hand. I thought of every dinner where I waited for Daniel to defend me, and every morning I forgave him. Before he asked, then I reached into my purse, took out my wedding ring, and placed it on the table between us. The diamond made one soft sound against the wood. No, I said. You already showed me what I needed to see. There was a time when I thought power would feel loud. I imagined it would arrive with raised voices, slammed doors, and the satisfaction of watching people who hurt me finally feel small. But when power came to me, it felt like a pin resting between my fingers and Samuel Brooks waiting patiently for my decision. The room was still the same library. The same rain touched the windows. The same portraits watched from the walls. Yet nothing belonged to the same people anymore. Margaret stood near the fireplace with one hand on the mantel, her pride holding her upright more than her strength. Daniel remained across from me, staring at the wedding ring I had placed on the table as if it were a final document he had forgotten to read. Vanessa sat quietly by the window, all her careful confidence gone. I could have asked them to leave immediately. The law, the will, and the footage had given me that right. For one small moment, the thought passed through me. Not because I wanted them homeless or humiliated, but because I remembered the cold air against my wet dress, the suitcase wheels scraping over stone, and Daniel looking away when I needed him to look at me. Then I heard William's voice in my memory, weak but clear. Do not let them make you cruel, Emily. Make them honest. I picked up the pen. Margaret may remain in the East Guest Cottage under a formal residency agreement, I said. Margaret's eyes lifted, sharp with surprise. She will no longer have authority over staff, household finances, charitable distributions, or estate records. Samuel nodded and wrote it down. Daniel will resign from any voting position connected to Whitmore Holdings during the transition period, I continued. Daniel opened his mouth, but Samuel looked at him before he could speak. That is within her authority. Daniel closed it again. I turned to him. You will also cooperate with the divorce through separate counsel. No public statements. No blaming grief. No. Rewriting last night. His face tightened, but this time he did not argue. Vanessa rose slowly. I should go. No one stopped her. At the door, she looked back once, not at Daniel, but at me. Maybe she expected anger. Maybe she expected a speech. I gave her neither. Some people are not worth the dignity of a goodbye. When the door closed behind her, the room felt less crowded but not less broken. Claire came to me then. She did not make excuses. She only whispered, "I am sorry I stayed quiet." That was the first apology that did not ask anything from me. I touched her hand and said, "Then do not stay quiet next time." By late afternoon, the first documents were signed. Daniel's signature looked uneven. Mine did not. Margaret left the library without looking at me, followed by the sound of her heels moving down a hallway she no longer ruled. Samuel gathered the papers and placed William's letter in front of me. "He believed you would protect what mattered," he said. I looked around the house that had watched me leave in the rain and return with the truth. "Then that is what I will do," I said. And for the first time since William died, the silence in that room did not feel empty. It felt like a beginning. 3 months later, the rain returned, but I was no longer afraid of what it remembered. It came softly that morning, tapping against the tall windows of Whitmore House while I stood in the main hall with a cup of coffee warming my hands. The marble floor had been polished, the lilies removed, and the table where Daniel had once pushed separation papers toward me was now covered with scholarship applications, foundation letters, and handwritten notes from women who had started over with less than I had carried in that suitcase. I had reopened Williams Foundation under a new program for families rebuilding after abandonment, illness, and quiet forms of loss people rarely see from the outside. The first grant went to a young mother from Syracuse who wrote that she had slept in her car for 2 nights before finding shelter. I approved it before the coffee on my desk went cold. That was the kind of power I wanted. Not power that punished. Power that protected. Daniel signed the divorce papers in a courthouse office on a clear Tuesday afternoon. He looked older, though only a few weeks had passed. He apologized again, more carefully this time, without blaming grief or Margaret or the pressure of the company. I accepted the apology, but I did not mistake it for a reason to return. Love, once used as a place to hide cowardice, does not become a home again simply because regret knocks at the door. Margaret moved into the East Guest cottage with her pearls, her silence, and fewer visitors than she expected. Sometimes I saw her walking the garden paths alone. She never asked me for forgiveness. I never asked her for remorse. The law had taken her authority, but life would have to teach her humility if she was willing to learn it. Claire came by often. She helped with the foundation and learned to speak before silence became agreement. In time, the house changed with us. The staff no longer lowered their eyes. The curtains Vanessa had chosen never arrived. William's portrait remained above the fireplace, but beneath it I placed a small table with the letters he loved most, the ones from students, nurses, widows, and children who knew his generosity better than his own family had. On the first morning the foundation reopened, I walked to the front door and stepped onto the porch alone. The security camera was still above me, quiet and black beneath the roofline. The stone steps were clean. The driveway was silver with rain. I stood in the same place where I had once held a suitcase in one hand and a dead man's handkerchief in the other, waiting for someone behind me to remember my worth. No one had. So the truth did. I did not raise my voice. I did not chase their love. I did not turn my pain into cruelty just to prove I had survived it. I simply stayed standing long enough for the door that closed behind me to become the door I owned. They threw me out because they thought I had nothing. But the truth was already inside the house, waiting for my name to be read first. And in the end, I learned this. Silence is not weakness when it is carrying evidence, dignity, and the strength to walk away.